Daf Yomi Tractate Bava Metzia, page 100. Top of the page with the Mishnah. The new Mishnah of Hamachlif Para B'Chamor B'Yaldam, etc. With regard to one who exchanges a cow for a donkey, such that by virtue of the cow owner's act of acquisition on the donkey's erstwhile owner simultaneously acquires the cow, wherever it happens to be located, and afterward the cow is found to have calved. And similarly, with regard to one who sells his Canaanite maidservant, with the acquisition effected by the buyer giving him money, and afterward she is found to have given birth to a child, who will be a slave belonging to his mother's master. At times, it is uncertain whether the offspring was born before or after the transaction. If this seller says the birth occurred before I sold the cow or maidservant, and so the offspring belongs to me, the buyer says the birth occurred before I purchased the cow or maidservant, and so the offspring belongs to me, they divide the value of the offspring between them. The Mishnah continues, there is a case of one who had two Canaanite slaves, one large, worth more on the slave market, and one small, worth less on the slave market. And similarly, one who had two fields, one large and one small. He sold one of them, and there was a dispute between the buyer and the seller concerning which one was sold. If the buyer says, I purchased the large one, and the other one, the seller says, I do not know which one I sold, the buyer is entitled to take the large one. If the seller says, I sold the small one, and the buyer says, I do not know which one I purchased, the buyer is entitled to take only the small one. If this one says the large one was sold, and that one says the small one was sold, then the seller takes it off that it was the small one that he sold, and then the buyer takes the small one. If this one says, I do not know which one was sold, and that one says, I do not know which one was sold, they divide the disputed amount between them. The Gemara asks in the first clause of the Mishnah, why do the two parties divide the value of the offspring between them? Instead, let us see in whose domain the offspring currently is. That person has presumptive ownership of the offspring, and the other person will be considered to be the one who is exacting property from another, and accordingly, the burden of proof rests upon him. Since he cannot prove his claim, he is not entitled to take the offspring. Amar Rav Chia bar Avin, Amar Shmuel. The Gemara answers, Rav Chia bar Avin says in the name of Shmuel, the Mishnah is referring to a case where the calf is standing in the marsh. It is in the domain of neither the buyer nor the seller, and so neither one has presumptive ownership. And with regard to the maidservant also, this is a case where the child is found in an alley, which does not belong to either the buyer or the seller. Okay. The Gemara asks further, but even if the offspring is not in either party's domain, establish it to be in the presumptive ownership of its original owner. In other words, the seller, as he certainly owned the offspring when it was still a fetus. And so, the other person will be considered to be the one who was exacting property from another, and accordingly the burden of proof rests upon him, since he cannot prove his claim, he is not entitled to take the offspring. Hamani, Sumchasi, Amr Mama, Namutul Besavik, Cholkin, below Shavua. The Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is the ruling of this Mishnah, that the parties divide the value of the offspring equally, is in accordance with the opinion of Sumchas, who says, when there is property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it equally without the need to take an oath. Mamon hamutal v'safek cholkin. Okay. Okay. The Gemara challenges this, say that this Sumchas says his ruling when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. V'shema v'shema. V'bari v'bari mi amar. In such a claim, each claims as each party admits that his claim to property is uncertain, but did he say his ruling when there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim, as each party claims to be certain that the property belongs to him? The Gemara offers two opinions concerning the ruling of Sumchas. Rabba bar Huna said yes, Sumchas says his ruling even when there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim. Another opinion, Rava said, actually, when Sumchas said his ruling, it applies only when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. But when there was a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim, he did not say his ruling. And in order that the Mishnah not pose a difficulty, amend it to refer to uncertain claims and teach. This seller says, perhaps the birth occurred before I sold the cow or maidservant. And that buyer says, perhaps the birth occurred after I purchased the cow or maidservant. Okay. Where was I? Rava bar Huna, so this is divide the amount. I think maybe we'll stop here and do part B.